All right, the third part of this lecture, and I've discovered that I've held a very long lecture, so I'll keep this very much shorter. I'll just say a few words about the second of these articles, Taleb and Blyth, and so they have an article in Foreign Affairs, easy to read. Clear arguments. It's from 2011, so straight after the Arab Spring, so-called. Late 2010, but in particular 2011, all these events, which I referred to before, briefly before the break. The Black Swan of Cairo, how suppressing volatility makes the world less predictable and more dangerous. So that really sums up their take on these issues. It's about black swans. It's not really mostly about the Black Swan of Cairo, which is in Egypt, but Egypt was at the time in 2011 the symbol of these new things happening. And the article, of course, was written before we knew the full extent of all this. The Syrian civil war, for instance, started after, for real, at least after the article was written. The Yemen war certainly started after the article was written. And the invasion or attack on Libya by several Western countries, including Norway, happened almost simultaneously. So Egypt was the main thing, along with Tunisia at the time. It is both misguided and dangerous to push unobserved risks further into the statistical tails of the probability distribution of outcomes and allow these high-impact, low-probability tail risks, black swans, to disappear from policymakers' fields of observation. What the world is witnessing in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, and eventually in several other countries, is simply what happens when highly constrained systems explode. Suppressing of volatility. The levels of corruption, the level of political repression, the level of economic repression to a certain extent. That means that there's limited amounts of information on what's going on below the surface, the preferences of people, the anger of people, dissatisfaction. And these things are piling up and becoming gradually worse into a tipping point when something else, happens. And you have the vendor in Tunisia setting himself on fire, and you have, perhaps an increase in food prices. And you have the beginning of demonstrations in one place, and then you have an avalanche, a domino effect, and eventually the whole region is changed. Dramatic events. And that's really what happens, according to the authors, when you have a system that depresses and keeps a lid on preferences, on grievances, on natural developments. So instability shouldn't, they say, the authors say, instability shouldn't be repressed, all the time. People like, and regimes like, to keep a lid on trouble. But that, the system, the country might act as a pressure cooker, and suddenly things boil over, which the authors argue is the case with the Arab Spring. So that's really, in a risk perspective, political risk, geopolitical risk perspective, an interesting take. When you estimate the likelihood of future developments, their impact on businesses, you also have to allow for the possibility that what you perceive to be stability might not really be stability. And dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, which is kind of the North Africa, Middle East version of a regime. And it's the Belarus, if we're talking about really current events. In Belarus you have seeming stability because you have one man having governed an authoritarian regime in Europe for many, many, many years. You have the same in Central Asia. You have these, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, governed by autocrats, leftovers from the Cold War. You've had regime change in Kyrgyzstan, the fifth of these so-called Stan countries in Central Asia. But the point is that these seem very stable for many, many years. And they're structured that way that they repress instability. That's their mission, really. We're governing forever. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, he's governing forever. That's his objective. But doing that requires repressing stability. And then, something happened. You had an election, which was probably not, a really fair election. You had that a few days ago. And then people start protesting, then demonstrate more. And now you have these huge protests, huge pressure on Lukashenko to leave his post as the leader of Belarus. But these signs have been there, according to the authors. They would say, Taleb and Blyth would say that, this is what happens when you keep an artificial lid on grievances, instability, people's voices. So there's no visible risks. There haven't really been visible risks in Belarus for the last few years. Some hints now and then. And prior to 2011 in the Middle East and North Africa, you didn't really have any signs that anything would go fundamentally wrong or that the region would blow up. In Syria, the worst case of a civil war in recent times, before 2011, the country was stable. Bashar al-Assad had replaced his father a few years earlier, and his father had been governing for many, many years. So they had decades of, governing the country in an authoritarian way. And recent years before 2011 were high growth years, stable years. And then something happens in Tunisia, and then other places. And then you have demonstrations in Syria. And you have an acceleration, you have the regime is heavy-handed, and suddenly you end up with all these grievances boiling over, sectarian grievances. Ethnic group against ethnic group, religion against religion, and you have a full-scale, horrible civil war. And the authors would say that, the Syrian system is fragile. It was fragile. Stability was artificial. No visible risks, but the risks were under the surface. And these countries are prone to black swans. The typical cases where you should watch if a country is repressing stability, repressing instability rather, that's a warning sign. And the longer it takes, the worse the blow-up becomes. And risks should really be visible and out in the open. So this is also an article that really argues for, freedom of expression, of political freedom. And one of the positive things about freedoms are exactly this, that preferences, grievances, complaints are out in the open, in real democracies. Excuse me. Okay, so you have a number of cases where fluctuations, instability, ups and downs are repressed. It's typical for the economy. We do not want, and countries and central banks do not want to go back, if we go back over 100 years, these booms and busts, or 80 years, 90 years, these ups and downs were dramatic and caused a lot of pain. And now we tend to, by instituting, certain kinds of policies, we tend to flatten out these ups and downs. The same is true in foreign policy. Support for incumbent regimes, that means the regimes that are in power at the time. The positive thing about that is that you can be pretty certain that in the near future things continue in a stable direction. So the Western world and the US in particular, they supported Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the stable authoritarian leader which helped cause stability in the region and which had a good relationship to Israel, which is the key ally of the US. So you support an authoritarian regime, an authoritarian person, Hosni Mubarak, because that's kind of the realpolitik, the sensible thing to do, even if you're a country like the US, which tends to talk about the importance of elections, of democracies, of free speech, etc. So you weigh these two things and you find that, okay, let's support this dictator or authoritarian. Let's support this dictator or authoritarian. The European regimes did basically the same. The French, the Italians, and supporting these North African authoritarian regimes, because that is really something that can secure the status quo, which means that tomorrow will be the same as today, and we do not know what a regime change will lead to. So, and the authors think that this is the wrong strategy. And they come with this fairly long citations. Attempts to institutionally engineer the world come in two types: those that conform to the world as it is, and those that attempt to reform the world. The nature of humans, quite reasonably, is to intervene in an effort to alter the world and the outcomes it produces. Government interventions are laden with unintended and unforeseen consequences, particularly in complex systems. So humans must work with nature by tolerating systems that absorb human imperfection, systems that, aren't perfect, but systems that do not keep a lid on problems, rather than seek to change them. Humans must try to resist the illusion of control. So it's also an argument against, the intellect and the capacity of leaders, of human beings, of states to engineer change. So, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, it couldn't work because it's too complex. And you have a lot of unforeseen, unintended consequences, and the illusion of control is and was really too big in that case. Taleb and Blyth argues that, and it's the same kind of analytical separation between two kinds of system. You have the linear system, the regular patterns, and mediocrity is predictability, low degree of interaction among components. And then you have the complex system, the extremistan version. It's kind of the same thing: extremely low predictability, high degree of interdependence among components. Shift in one end of this system produces a lot of effects around the system. You have these tipping points, these sand castles, really. You can build, sand and add more sand. Eventually the whole thing collapses, because when you reach a tipping point, like you can argue they did in North Africa and the Middle East, with the corruption, the repression, the lack of freedom of expression, freedom of religion sometime. Perhaps they reached a tipping point, and that's what happened in 2010. And okay, I had to pause it for a while because my voice is struggling a bit. But two systems, yes. Tipping points, yes. The system, not the components, is responsible. Let me just talk a bit through Taleb and Blyth about regime and policy predictability, because that's also very important in a political risk perspective. How stable is that this and that political system? So if we invest, if we have placed all this money in this country, like the Americans did back in Iran in the 1970s, how safe are our investment? What will happen? Is this what's the characteristics of the regime in terms of possibilities of instability, of grievances, of conflict? So you have something called shock suppressing political systems, where you keep an artificial almost lid on problems, on instability, on the complaints of people. Iran in the 1970s was such a case. A Shah, a king of Iran supported by the US, who really didn't pick up on how unpopular he really was among large segments of the people. You can ask the same question about Iran today, because it's not a fully fledged, democracy by any means, although it has certain of these traits, institutions, elections, and so forth. But that's a key question today. How stable is the Iranian regime? Probably fairly stable, but it's a difficult question to answer if you're not really an Iranian expert, an area expert. Iraq, Libya, and we can add Syria, were really, the same kind of shock suppressing political systems. Iraq certainly was that during the era of Saddam Hussein, who governed for years and years and years until the Americans invaded in 2003. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya governed for decades until he was eventually attacked by Norway and Denmark and Great Britain and the US and France, etc. back in 2011. And then you have the Syrian authoritarian Bashar al-Assad, who's still alive and still running this Syrian, or parts at least, of the Syrian territory, Syrian state. And then you can ask that, or ask the question, what is, they are shock-suppressing political system. Iraq, Saddam Hussein, he represents the Sunni Muslims, which is a really minority in Iraq. And the Sunni Muslims are supported and they're ranked in the hierarchy of Iraqis, or the Iraqi regime, above the Shia Muslims and certainly the Kurds. And the Kurds and the Shia Muslims is the largest such group in Iraq. They're certainly dissatisfied and would certainly want Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein to go. And that's what happens in 2003. But then you remove the lid. You remove the authoritarian. You remove the man and the regime responsible for a certain level of stability in Iraq. Stability through gruesome repression and sometimes massacres and sometimes foreign adventures, interventions into other countries like Kuwait or Iran. The invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the war against Iran in 1980-88. All these things, these terrible things, but you can say on the positive side, and some say that, the Russians would say that, look at Libya, look at Iraq, how it was. It was a terrible regime in certain respects, but it was stable at least. But underneath Iraq, you certainly have, before 2003, forces that are craving to get out. And you certainly have that in Libya. Now Libya is in a civil war. You certainly had that in Syria. You had that Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Stable, 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 seemingly, until things started changing in the early 1990s. The Cold War is over. You don't have that, external pressure and forces that can keeping the lid in Yugoslavia. And then you get nation against nation. Croats against Serbs, Serbs against Muslims or Bosniaks, and Slovenes leaving the whole Yugoslavia. You get, all these constellations and wars, sectarianism, and one has to look as best as one can beneath the surface in these political systems where it's obvious that a lot of complaints and grievances and possibilities of instability is artificially repressed. Because when the lid is removed, you get into a situation often with total unpredictability and drama and drastic measures and gruesome wars, as in Yugoslavia, as in Syria, as in Iraq, as in Libya currently. And then you have the second worst, the shock-absorbing political systems, which of course the authors favor. Political tensions are out in the open. You know about grievances, about preferences, about complaints. So when the authors say that, I think they highlight Italy, they've had, and we know Italy since the Second World War have had possibly 100 different governments, which signals instability. But on the positive side, it gets these conflicts and up in the open, these political conflicts. There's a certain element of stability and regularity in changing governments often. There's some downsides to it, but and it's even clearer now in this Lebanon example, which is a current example, because now a lot of things happen in Lebanon, a lot of unfortunate things. You had the explosion, the terrible explosion a couple of weeks ago. You had people demonstrating, government officials or government leaders, being forced to step down. You have big problems with the coronavirus, the economy of Lebanon, the lack of support from former allies, and you're embedded into a volatile region with a lot of conflict lines. That's Lebanon today. Hugely problematic situation. But Lebanon has this political setup, political institutions that they agreed on, different groups, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Christians, that they agreed on in the early 1990s. Before that, you had a gruesome civil war, you had external intervention by the Israelis, and all hell was loose in Lebanon. But after the 1990s, Lebanon has functioned as a viable state against all odds, because Lebanon shouldn't really function, because it's so complex. The setup and the distribution, the ethnic divisions, separations, is so complex that it's hard to devise a structure of government that make these different groups satisfied in the long run. Lebanon has managed to do that by, getting into the constitution, the new constitution in the early 1990s, setting up a system of government where these different groups, the Shia Muslims, represented by the Hezbollah movement, getting the Shia Muslims, the Sunni Muslims, and the Christians to share power in a very complex way, but which has worked to a large extent, because Lebanon is such a complex society, such complex country, that it shouldn't really work. So you should expect a lot of trouble in Lebanon. So I agree with the basic point of Taleb and Blyth that, Lebanon is a perfect example of a system where shocks can be absorbed in a very, very volatile or difficult situation. Same is true for the US, for instance, the US is an extreme example maybe of, people can voice their opinions on everything, and the Soviets used to complain during the Cold War that often, the problem is a lack of information, but with the US, if you analyze that as the Soviet Union did, the problem is the opposite. There's too much information, too much noise. What the hell do these Americans really want with their foreign policies, domestic policies? There are certain advantages with this, and government changes are regular, and no single group, as in Lebanon, are permanently excluded from power. So if you go to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, the Shia Muslims were permanently excluded from power. In Lebanon, the Shia Muslims are in power and can foresee a future where they also are in power. But it's the same with the Sunni Muslims, the same with the Christians. Because you have a constitution and an acceptance of that constitution. But of course, people demonstrate against these politicians anyway, not least because of the level of corruption among the elites and the lack of a sound governance in many areas. But as a political system, the setup in Lebanon is quite impressive on many levels, it seems. I'm no Lebanon expert, but it seems that it really works, has worked up until now. Okay, I think we're near the end. The authors point to two mental biases. Human beings think they have control when they don't have control. And we like to have control, and we like to dampen risks. That's where insurance companies, to use that example again, they make money because people don't like risks often. But sometimes we have this, like the US invasion of Iraq, we think, or the Americans think, and the British think, now this will work out fine because we're knowledgeable, we're strong, and the people will greet us as liberators, and all these things, we're too confident, we have too high confidence in ourselves, often is the message. The second is the action bias, that we have to do something. In an imperfect world, we all often think, okay, we have to do something. I think it's fair to say that this is in particular a US tendency. We know that from studies of different, regimes. The US is often impatient. There's a problem, let's fix the problem, even if the problem is non-fixable, at least in the short term. Okay, US policy toward the Middle East has historically, and especially since 9/11, been unduly focused on the repression of any and all political fluctuations in the name of preventing Islamic fundamentalism. So you support these regimes, in large part at least, to repress this wish among large segments of the people to let Islam, Sharia, govern the country. Islamists, the US doesn't want, normally at least, Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood, and etc., in power in these key allied countries. So you support the dictator. This is wrong, the authors say. The West and its autocratic Arab allies, there are many left, by the way, they have strengthened Islamic fundamentalists by forcing them underground, and even more so by killing them. Again, Egypt is a prime example, because you had massacres, you had imprisonments of people belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist movement that were briefly in power after Hosni Mubarak were kicked out. And it seems that I've reached the end, and I hope you after this lecture you've gotten a little bit wiser vis-a-vis the term paper, your obligations in that respect. We have peeked into the geopolitical risk analysis, prediction business, and also keep in mind that black swans exist, and keep in mind that it might be useful to speculate a little bit, think a little bit, reflect a little bit on that when you devise your term paper. Okay, I'll see you later.